What if Meghan Markle's royal ambition never started with Harry? What if he was just making no and convenient? Now that's a heavy question. Now go. But the promise that any strategy guarantees an avoidance return is fundamentally flawed. But there is one approach that creates the highest probability. Convenient? Now, that's a heavy question. Not because it implies malice, but because it suggests something far more disturbing. Calculation, timing, access. A method, not a mistake. And for years, we've watched the headlines bend around her. Some painted her a victim, others a villain. But what if we've all been watching the wrong man? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because tucked quietly behind the chaos, there's always been another royal figure lingering in the shadows. A man whose own scandals were conveniently silenced, who slipped back into palace life under the radar, and whose proximity to Meghan Markle, both physical and personal, has raised eyebrows among insiders. Not rumors, not gossip, eyewitness accounts, sworn testimony.
Records. And one confession that changes everything.
And it didn't come from a reporter, or a rival royal, or a vengeful ex. It came from a maid. Someone who cleaned the rooms, refilled the soaps, took out the trash, and watched the whole twisted story unfold from behind a vacuum cart. You don't usually hear from people like her. But this time, you will. She stayed silent for years, loyal to the Queen, loyal to her job. But then, something happened. Something too strange, too precise, too humiliating to ignore. And it forced her to break her silence, forced her to put her name on the record. And once she did, the palace scrambled to cover it up. So now the question isn't just whether Meghan and Prince Andrew were involved, it's how deep did it go? How long did it last? And why has no one dared to connect the dots until now? There are surveillance gaps, private guest lists, a missing bracelet, diary entries never meant to be read, audio logs the palace never wanted released. And when you piece them together, a different version of the royal story starts to take shape. One where the corridors between their rooms weren't just hallways, they were paths, intentional paths, traveled often, at night. And before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a moment months or years later and realized it wasn't innocent? Maybe it was a glance, a phrase, a pattern, something your gut clocked before your brain could. That's what this is. The story that didn't make sense back then suddenly starts clicking into place. And once it does, there's no going back. Because it all begins, not with an affair, not even with a whisper, but with a piece of jewelry that should have never left Andrew's bedroom. And once it did, the palace staff started talking. Not to reporters, to each other. And once they did, the security logs started to surface. Not through official channels, through hush-hush USB drives, left behind in coat pockets, shared in fear. And then, quietly, without warning, the maid who saw everything stepped forward. And what she said didn't just raise questions. It detonated them. But here's the twist. You probably haven't heard about any of this, because every time it came close to going public, at a hearing, a tabloid, even during Harry's court battles, it vanished, pulled, buried. Scrubbed.
And the people who tried to keep it alive?
Transferred. Paid off. Or in one case, fired for inappropriate speculation. That phrase again. Speculation. Palace word for, you're getting too close. But how close is too close when someone inside the palace confirms it? When the maid says, in her own words, I walked in, and I saw the Duchess, and the Duke of York. Are you able? And they weren't talking politics? That line alone, 7 words, is enough to fracture what little remains of royal reputation management. Because once the words affair, Meghan, and Andrew start circulating in the same breath, the media goes feral. The palace goes silent. And the public? They either retreat into denial or start looking at old footage with fresh eyes. You know those moments? Trooping McCullough, Queen's funeral. Subtle glances. Shifts in posture. We all assumed it was discomfort between Meghan and Kate. But what if that frost came from somewhere else? Someone else? What if the real story isn't who Meghan alienated, but who she aligned with? And let's pause here, not to sensationalize, not to judge, but to think, why does this matter now? Because this isn't about affairs. It's not even about palace gossip. It's about trust. Trust inside a system built on hierarchy, silence, and performance. And if someone as visible and controversial as Meghan Markle allegedly crossed boundaries with one of the most scandal-laden royals in modern history, while married to his nephew, that's not just tabloid fodder, that's institutional rot. And it gets worse. Because when you start pulling this thread, something strange happens. Names come up that don't make sense. Events that should be random start syncing up. And the people most responsible for managing the fallout suddenly vanish from their posts. One security advisor, gone. A housekeeper, reassigned. A PR aide with health complications. One maid, but not before she made a copy of everything she witnessed. And here's the real kicker. None of this was supposed to come out. Until a single object, a bracelet, showed up on Meghan's wrist. Photographed, archived, then deleted from palace press releases. That's when the whispers started up again. That's when the timelines were rechecked. That's when a royal staffer sent an anonymous email that ended up in a tabloid's inbox before the legal team intercepted it. And that's where we begin. Because this story isn't just about a forbidden connection. It's about how the system tried to erase it. About what gets buried and what refuses to stay buried. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds like palace fiction. A scandal too lurid to be real. Meghan and Andrew. Come on. But stories don't form in a vacuum. And when a dozen little inconsistencies pile up over time, they start to resemble something else entirely. Pattern. And patterns demand questions. So we're going to ask them, one by one. Why did Meghan get unfettered access to wings of the palace she didn't officially reside in? Why did Andrew reappear at more royal events, just as Meghan was pulling back? Why did Harry look visibly shaken during his final walkabout with his uncle? Why did one royal aide say privately, "They're more alike than anyone dares admit"? And why, despite all the denials, all the PR spin, all the avoidance, has no one directly addressed the accusations from the Maid? Not once, not officially. So today we go back, room by room, record by record, footstep by footstep. And by the time we finish, you may never look at that era of the royal family the same way again. Because if even half of what this maid alleges is true, it upends everything. The Harry-Meghan narrative, the Andrew scandal, the Queen's alleged inaction, Charles's distant demeanor, the timing of their exits, the media manipulation, the legal threats, the change in security detail, the sudden disappearance of staff,
And Meghan's slow descent from modern duchess to something far more polarizing.
And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about finding freedom. Maybe this was about access. Strategic positioning. Allegiances formed behind closed doors. Now, none of this comes without pushback. We're not here to smear. We're here to ask, to examine the details buried beneath silence, to challenge the carefully curated timelines, and to give voice to the people who saw what happened but were never supposed to speak. Like the maid. Because her voice was supposed to be erased, but not today. Today, she tells her story, and it all starts with one object, one photograph. One misplaced item that was never supposed to leave Andrew's private suite. The gold bracelet. The one Meghan wore briefly, subtly, at a charity dinner. The one that matches a set Andrew received in the late 90s from a foreign dignitary, and has never, until now, been seen again, except on her. Except now. And once we examine what that means, the entire story begins to unravel. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. So here's the thing. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't a diary entry or a staff confession or a blurry image snapped behind palace gates. It was a bracelet, a simple gold bracelet, delicate, understated, not flashy enough to raise immediate alarms. But it did something no formal accusation ever could. It confirmed what many inside the palace had only whispered. It was May, early summer. Meghan had made a surprise appearance at a modest charity dinner for a children's foundation. Low press turnout, mostly donor families, some mid-tier royals. Not the kind of event that sparks global headlines. But in one photo, taken by an attendee on a personal phone, something caught the eye of someone who knew better. The bracelet. It wasn't on the official accessory list provided by her stylist team. It wasn't on loan from Cartier or Van Cleef. It wasn't part of any royal collection logged under her name. And it wasn't hers. That's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the bracelet she wore that evening, thin, textured, a curved bar clasp with two embedded garnets, had last been seen decades earlier on the wrist of Prince Andrew. A private gift, a custom design, one of a kind, and one that hadn't been publicly visible in years until it suddenly reappeared on Meghan. And before you jump to conclusions, yes, fine, it could have been a coincidence. Maybe it was a copy. Maybe Andrew had more than one. Maybe Meghan found it in a drawer and didn't know what it was. That's what her team would suggest, if they were ever forced to comment. But here's the problem. There's only one known photo of that bracelet from the original collection, a candid from 1999, taken during a diplomatic visit to Bahrain. Andrew wearing a pale gray suit, resting his hand on the back of a camel of all things. The bracelet visible just beneath his cuff, and it matches down to the clasp. Now, here's where it stops being an innocent fashion fluke and starts becoming something else. Because when the photo of Meghan surfaced, it was immediately flagged, not by the public, by palace staff. Specifically, by someone in the wardrobe department who used to be assigned to Andrew's private quarters. This person, who has remained anonymous for obvious reasons, saw the image and reportedly muttered 4 words to a colleague. She wasn't supposed to, as in she wasn't supposed to wear it, as in she wasn't supposed to have it, as in someone gave it to her, and that opened the door. Because the next question wasn't if she had it was how she got it. And here's where things start overlapping in uncomfortable ways. Because sometime between late March and early May, multiple palace staff members recall Meghan being granted unscheduled access to Andrew's wing, not formally logged. No press photos. No security alerts. But 3 different aides recall seeing her in areas not usually assigned to her suite, at least twice, of once in the morning, once after midnight. No explanation given. No reason needed. Technically, she had clearance. She was a working royal at the time, still officially in with the family, despite growing tensions. But these movements weren't random. They were rhythmic, familiar. And according to the maid's eventual testimony, Meghan was seen leaving Andrew's hallway, adjusting her coat and looking flushed. That was her word. Flushed. Now, again, that's not confirmation of anything. We're not in the room. We don't know what was said, what was done, what the context was.
But the bracelet? That speaks.
It doesn't scream. It just. Lingers quietly.